All right. Let's get started. Oh, I guess I better. Yes. Let's get started. Let's let people in. All right. Hi, everyone. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay. For some reason, I don't know why, whenever I start Zoom, it tells me my audio isn't working, even though it's always working. It's really weird. Zoom is strange. So let's see. We've got 20 people so far. Let's just wait one more minute in case anyone else shows up a little late. And in the meantime, I'll just share my screen so that everyone can see my slides. All right. Oh, that's the wrong slides. Let's open the right slides. Oh boy, mornings. That's the one. All right. Okay, looks like we're still at 20 people. So yeah, slides are open. Might as well get going. So chapter 1 is from the first section of Blackmore, which the entire section is entitled The Problem. But what is the problem when it comes to consciousness? Well, if we make it all the way through these slides in today's lecture, you'll see that the problem is really, well, really, there's multiple problems when it comes to tackling questions concerning consciousness. So I hope that that's where we get today. If not, no big deal. We'll just pick it up again next week. Yeah, I hope that this lecture will sort of elucidate some of the problems that those of us in consciousness studies face. This is sort of the crux of the problem that Blackmore is going to be talking about in this lecture. She starts this chapter off thusly. I'll just read this quote out loud. The problem of consciousness is related to some of the oldest questions in philosophy. What is the world made of? How did it get here? Who or what am I? What is the point of it all? In particular, it is related to the mind-body problem. That is, what is the relationship between the physical and the mental? Now, I'm sure that some of you have heard of the mind-body problem before. After all, some of you may have already taken a philosophy class. The mind-body problem we'll talk about in a moment, but this interaction between the mental and the physical is kind of at the core of the problems that Blackmore is discussing here. It's as I mentioned last time, right? How does this physical physical system in my head, this meat machine that is my brain, which can be studied objectively, this object in my head, how does that generate a subjective experience? That's kind of the modern way of casting this problem. But it's not the way we've always casted it, as I'll talk about momentarily. So enough of the problem that we're going to try and tackle today. What about consciousness itself? Just what is consciousness? What is it that we're talking about here? Well, nowadays we use the term consciousness to refer largely to awareness or to our experience. Consciousness used to be somewhat synonymous with mind, but that's not really the case anymore. And I think that's evidenced by the fact that many philosophers nowadays actually draw a distinction between things like intelligence and consciousness. Oh, more people are still showing up. So intelligence and consciousness, what I mean by that is, and I'll give you an example from my area of interest, which is to do with robots and artificial intelligence. So some people ask me about AI. I'll get students who ask me about artificial intelligence. They'll ask me about something called strong AI or strong artificial intelligence. A strong artificial intelligence would be more or less equivalent to a human being in terms of what it can do, the problems it can solve, so forth. But sometimes people will also ask me, would that machine be conscious? Well, not necessarily, because intelligence and consciousness are not exactly the same thing, right? So that's just something to be aware of as we proceed through the class. I mean, we've studied the mind, getting back to the human mind and the human brain. We've studied it long enough that some of the mystery surrounding how it works has kind of disappeared, right? I mean, we've learned a lot about how the brain works in recent years. I'll just minimize my video here so you can read this. You know, we've got multiple different ways of looking at what the brain is doing while it's doing it. We've got functional magnetic resonance imaging. We've got PET scans. We've got electroencephalography, right? We can see what's going on in the brain and see how it works. We've come a long way from the 19th century when we were just dissecting brains and trying to understand them that way, right? And we understand things like, you know, the effects of drugs, you know, like pharmaceuticals. These could be, you know, prescription drugs, recreational drugs. We understand how and why they have an effect on the brain. We also now understand more about why brain damage has some of the effects that it does on the brain. We know about neurotranslators and neuromodulators. These are little chemical messengers that modulate or help send messages across synapses in the brain. And synapses are, of course, where the axons and dendrites, little hairy extensions of nerve cells in the brain, meet and exchange information. We know about cortical columns, firing patterns and groups of neurons. We know a lot about the physical stuff, right? But consciousness remains a mystery. As I said last time, quoting Daniel Dennett, human consciousness may be just about the last surviving mystery. If I can get my slide to change, we can talk more about this mystery. Come on, there we go. Now, some thinkers wonder if consciousness will one day disappear as a useful term, right? It's not like we won't be conscious anymore, but maybe consciousness will be removed from the scientific lexicon. Maybe it will go the way of élan vital. Élan vital means vital spirit. Back in the day, we're talking before Darwin, before Pasteur, before a lot of these important scientific figures who studied life, scientists had this concept of élan vital, or the vital spirit. We didn't really know how life worked, right? We didn't know about genetics. We didn't know about metabolism. We didn't know much about the biology of life. We didn't understand how what would otherwise be just dead matter organized in such and such a way could be alive. So there must be a vital spirit, a sort of life force that animates living beings. So élan vital was like a theoretical term that we use to try and explain why there are animate beings, right? But now we know much more about life, right? We don't really need this term élan vital anymore. We don't need élan vital to explain how life works. And this is something that comes from the philosopher Patricia Churchland, who thinks that maybe our whole scientific and philosophical framework for understanding what consciousness is will one day evolve to the point where we might not even need the word consciousness anymore. Consciousness, as Churchland says, may go the way of caloric fluid or vital spirit or any of these other sort of concepts that we use to explain things, which we don't really need because we've got better explanations now, right? So what is the problem? The problem is basically as follows. In scientific understanding and in our everyday lives, we end up with two different kinds of stuff when we talk about the mind. There's physical stuff and there's mental stuff. The physical stuff would include matter and energy. Mental stuff might be like thoughts and sensations. And this is a position, as I'll discuss in a moment, known as dualism. Can we think of some examples of some different physical stuff and mental stuff? I know I just said very broadly matter and energy, but what differentiates physical stuff from mental stuff? Does anyone want to take a crack at it? You can do so via video or in the chat here.
Hello.
Hello.
Would like synapses and stuff be considered physical?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Because it's part of the physical system in the brain, right?
So mental stuff would just be like my sad depression.
Yeah.
Or like internal expression. Yay.
Yeah. Like your inner experience, we would think of as mental stuff. Sort of along the lines. Okay, Katie's raised a hand. Go ahead.
Well, it said in the like chapter, said like if you're in pain or whatever for the physical stuff or mental. Yeah.
Yeah, like if you're the sensation of pain would be mental, the neurons firing,
yeah,
those are going to be physical, right?
I was kind of saying what he said, but for the mental part of it.
Right. Elijah in the chat says physical is something tangible, something that can be felt or sensed. Yeah, I mean, as we said, or rather as Descartes, who we'll talk about in a moment, says, the physical stuff is what is extended. It has mass, it takes up space, so on and so forth. And Drew, you've raised your hand. Go ahead.
Could you say that physical experiences are more objective, whereas mental processes are more subjective?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the problem when it comes to studying this stuff, right? Because I can look objectively at, a brain on a brain scan, right? But if I want to know what your inner experience is, I can't, beam myself into your brain or something, right? I have to ask you about it.
Like, for example, the way that one person feels 30 degrees is different from the way that somebody else feels 30 degrees, but it's still 30 degrees regardless.
Yeah, like if I visited a country that was very warm, right, and I'm not used to the temperature, the people who live there might not be bothered by the heat, but I might be. But the temperature is the same, right, as you say. So yeah, those are good examples. I'll just, no, I'll save what I was going to say for a little bit later. Now let's move on to try and tackle, as other philosophers have, or rather to see how other philosophers have tried to tackle this problem. There's a few different theories. We primarily divide different approaches to understanding the mind into these two camps. And I should mention, Blackmore doesn't mention this, but I feel like I should mention it. What we're doing here is metaphysics. We're doing metaphysics in addition to philosophy of mind. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that asks what kinds of things exist and what they are like. What are their properties? What is their essential nature, right? So we're asking here, if we're asking questions about the mental and the physical, we're asking, so how does all that work? Does the mental really exist? Or is the mental, subsumed within the physical? Or are there really two different kinds of stuff, physical stuff and mind stuff, right? Drew, I can't tell if you've got another question or if your hand is just still
Sorry,
up.
my hand was still up.
Okay, no worries. So there are two sort of camps, right? Monism, or more accurately, substance monism, which says that only one kind of stuff exists, and dualism, which, as the name implies, says that two kinds of stuff exist. So let's dive more into dualism and monism. Let's do monism first. Substance monism says that, again, only one kind of substance exists. And again, when I say substance, I'm talking about something very fundamental, right? I'm talking about what is everything ultimately composed of, made of? What is everything made of? One variety of monism says that everything is actually made of the mental, which is kind of weird if you think about it. But I mean, maybe, who knows? The mental world is what is fundamental. What does that mean? That means that the things that are really real, the things that actually exist, are just mental perceptions, ideas, stuff like that. This is called mentalism or idealism, and it was promoted famously by George Berkeley, who in his Metaphysics replaced matter with sensations. Go ahead,
can you
Elijah.
hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
So let's say everything is a sensation. Then how is it possible that we have studied atoms and like matter, and we know there's dark matter, there's the universe, and it's always
Right.
expanding? Like I didn't, when I was born, I didn't know the universe is expanding. That's not a sensation
Yes.
that I knew.
Yes. That's a really good question. And I can answer it by telling you a little bit more about Berkeley here, or Barclay. It's technically pronounced Barclay. So George Berkeley was actually a bishop. He was a Catholic guy, sort of a theologian. And he took a little bit of an issue with Isaac Newton's understanding of the cosmos that he had published in Principia Mathematica. He didn't agree with Newton's physical approach to understanding things. So I suppose, and I'm no expert on Berkeley, but I suppose because he thought that the scientific understanding that Newton and like Kepler and Galileo before him were offering threatened the position of God and scripture and whatnot, right? So Berkeley says, oh, maybe it's just all ideas. Who cares about the physical world? That's dumb. Physical worlds, there's no physical world, it's all ideas. And how is it possible that there are things unknown out there in the universe? Or how is it possible that things continue to exist when there's no minds to perceive them? Well, Berkeley says, like any Catholic bishop would, it's because of God. He believed that the mind of God was kind of like the guarantor of reality, because reality is all mental. It's kind of like if you think about the Matrix, except instead of the Matrix, it's the mind of God. Does that make sense to you?
Buy into like the idea that we are living in the image of God, and that our brain is like in theory a recreation of God, and so for that all of our mental processes are like universal almost.
Well, the physical brain, if you were to ask Berkeley, isn't even actually a physical brain, right? It's all just mental stuff. It's all ideas or representations or perceptions, right? Kind of like Elijah says here. Yeah, it is a classic explanation from a religious person in those times. Although I would counter that by saying Newton himself was a religious person. So I would counter that. So Neville Goddard's theory, I'm not, I don't think I'm familiar with that, but I'm going to have to check that out. Yeah. Thank you for the tip, Kelsey. I'm going to have to check Neville Goddard out. But yeah, the idea is that, oh, more participants raising. Okay, go ahead, Elijah first, and then Ayman. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think I forgot to put down my hand. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay, no problem.
Sorry.
All right, go ahead.
Yes, and you did pronounce my name correctly. So this is just he's basically going on the idea that everything's not like existing then? Like
Yeah,
everything's just simulation?
Y- yeah, like not like a simulation like we're used to thinking of a simulation,
Hmm.
but yeah, it's all kind of in the mind of God. That is what is real. And our
Like
minds are,
Skyrim.
yeah, I mean, I'm not too familiar with that, but it is very much kind of like a VR kind of
Yeah.
video
Because
gamey kind of way of thinking of the cosmos, right? Very
Yeah.
weird.
we're just imagination of God.
Yeah, exactly.
It must be
Imagination.
really freaky then.
Yeah, like I mean, if you think about it, it gets weird, right? But yeah,
Yeah.
like it's like if I said my phone here, there's no physical object. It's an idea. It's like we ourselves and God are dreaming up the universe, right? It's very weird, but interesting. So that's one variety of monism, where what is real, what is fundamentally real. I just saw that. No, if there's anyone from Jersey, I apologize, but I just saw Donovan's comment. So all things, including ourselves, are God's ideas. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, yeah, even us. So it's really weird. It's a weird theory, but that's one theory. And the other theory is that the physical world is what is fundamental. So only matter and energy exist. And here I should clarify, right? Some people think of energy as non-physical because it's not extended, right? Like my phone is extended. It takes up space. It has mass. It has volume, right? Energy is not like that. So some people, when they think of dualism, when we'll talk about in the moment, they make the mistake of thinking that, you know, the brain is physical, but the energy, whatever that means, is the mind, right? But that's not right. Energy, you know, if you're a physicalist, energy is just a property that physical things can have, right? So energy is also physical. It's not like this weird, you know, like Dragon Ball Z kind of understanding of energy, right? No, energy is part of the physical. So I just wanted to clarify that before we go any further. So there's a couple different types of substance monism when it comes to the physical. All of these, by the way, all kinds of substance monism with respect to you know, the physical world are called physicalism or materialism, right? So we have mentalism or idealism for, you know, the only thing that exists are ideas, representations, so forth. We use the term physicalism or materialism to talk about the theory that says that the physical world is what is fundamental. So only matter and energy exist. And yeah, as I mentioned, there are a few different varieties of this. We have identity theory, for example, which says that mental states are just brain states. And then we have functionalism, which says that mental states are functional states. And we'll probably have occasion to talk about each of these theories in more detail as the course unfolds. But of course, if you have any questions at any time, just let me know. Another idea is that consciousness may supervene on matter. Wherever we have the right kind of organized matter, like a brain, we also have consciousness. How that works, we're not exactly sure yet, but maybe one day we'll figure it out.
Could you re-explain that point once more?
For the supervenience?
Yeah.
Yeah, so supervenience is an interesting concept. It's kind of like, let's see, I will try and explain it with a simpler example. Let's see, I need an object. Man, I can never find a good object when I need one.
Guitar?
What's that?
Your guitar? Could that be an example?
Sure, I got a couple of those. So this guitar right here, it's blue. and it has these interesting patterns in the wood, right? So I could say this is a blue guitar, right? But really this blueness right here, this sort of, the way this blueness is like to me exists in my mind. It doesn't exist in the world, you know. Yes, there's certain wavelengths of light hitting the surface, reflecting and hitting my eyes and going to my occipital cortex and blah, 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 blah. We can talk about those physical properties, right? The wavelengths of light that are reflected and doing whatever. But this blueness right here supervenes on those properties, which are natural properties. And the blueness would be like, I don't know, a phenomenal property, maybe we could say, sort of like what it's like. So we can talk about certain wavelengths of light, for example, as natural properties, but the sort of phenomenal qualities that they elicit in our, sort of perceptual lives, those supervene on those physical properties. And it may be like that with the entire brain. Maybe consciousness supervenes on the right kinds of organized matter, like brains. Yeah. I think somebody had their hand up too while I was explaining there. Go ahead now before we discuss epiphenomenalism, if you like.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. I don't know. I had a question, but I wasn't really sure how to phrase it. But like just going back to your example of the guitar, because like you're talking about how it's blue. So like what if somebody was like colorblind, for example? Like would that mean that they had like a different state of consciousness, or would it just be the same?
I would say, yeah, definitely. Their conscious experience is definitely different, right? Because they might not experience color in the same way that a non-colorblind person would have. And notice, like in both cases, the natural properties we're talking about stay the same, right? But the conscious experience is different, and that's because of something to do with the physical makeup of the eye, right? Something to do with the rods and cones. So that's a great example, right? Of we've got this experiential thing that kind of supervenes on these physical structures. So yeah, Elijah, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not sure if I will get this out properly so it's understood, but being colorblind is a super good example, because if you're saying that everything is physical, if someone is colorblind, that basically like proves that that color does exist like objectively, because if everything was mental, that means that is blue to him. He is not colorblind, that's just how he sees blue, but if it's physical, that means that the color is real, and there is like one in like perception of it that is the real one, I guess.
Well, perhaps. I mean, I see what you're saying. Like the natural properties are real. The subjective experience is also real, but it's subjective, right? And this is like, you can kind of see why this is so difficult to study, even just talking about an example like this, I think. Like what is real? What exists independently of the mind? Does color exist independently of the mind? It does, if I guess you say that the phenomenal properties of color supervene on the physical properties of color. So it all depends on how you look at things. You know what I mean? But still fun to think about. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of relates to what Elijah and I were saying with the colorblindness. I saw this theory that basically states that one person's version of red could be another person's version of green.
Yeah,
right? So there's a different conscious experience of how we all view color, and there's really no way to prove that we're all viewing the same color.
That's right. That's right. That's called the inverted spectrum, right? It's a thought experiment that I believe is due to John Locke. although I could be mistaken about that. But yeah, imagine the spectrum of visual light, imagine here, and then take it and flip it around so that my red is your green, as you were describing. We'd have no way of knowing. Like, think about it. If we were talking about it amongst ourselves and I said, look at that object over there, we'd have no way of knowing that we have different experiences of color, different subjective experiences of color. So that's another problem, right? That's another problem. Like, if your blue is my red and my red is your blue, how could we ever communicate to each other that we were having different experiences? I mean, it's tricky. We can't get into each other's heads.
And wouldn't that also arise the problem of like trying to describe blue, because your version of blue would be completely different, and so thus me explaining my version of blue would not necessarily correlate to your version of the same color?
Yeah, I mean, I might say like, hey, it sounds like you're talking about green or something, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's crazy. Colors are qualia, right? Elijah's asking. Oh, I hope I didn't miss that. No, okay, you just asked that. Okay. Colors are qualia, something that cannot be described to someone else. Well, I mean, I don't know that we can't describe qualia, but yeah, I would say the experience of color is a quale. That's singular for qualia. And qualia are the sort of subjective, what it's like aspects of things, right? Like the redness of a rose or the bitter taste of coffee, right? These are qualia. How would you even describe a mental experience? I mean, it's tough. We kind of have to have the same shared world, right? It's kind of like in the philosophical investigations, Ludwig Wittgenstein at one point talks about trying to describe, like, imagine if you were to try and describe the aroma of coffee to an alien who had never smelled coffee before. You couldn't do it. Like, we don't share that world. So we've got a lot of hands up. Katie first, and then I'll just go down the list as I see it. So Katie, Haley, and then Danica.
Okay. So I wrote this thing in my notes from like the chapter things, and it's kind of making sense to what we're talking about.
Okay.
Like panpsychism says like the view that all material things have associated awareness or mental properties. So
yes.
like, can you explain that?
Oh, yeah. Well, we're going to get to it after
okay.
epiphenomenalism, I think. But basically, it's as you described it. It's like everything is a little bit mental, even maybe rocks. Maybe there's something it's like to be a rock, but it's less sophisticated than what it's like to be me, right? It's also an interesting, weird theory. So yeah, I'll describe it in a moment.
Okay.
All right. So Haley, go ahead.
I feel like this kind of relates to like the color thing, how everyone sees color differently and describes it differently. Would it be like how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you and stuff like that, because everyone's version of like someone is different?
Possibly. There are, for example, some interesting studies, and again, this has more to do with what I'm about to say has more to do with the physical makeup of the eye. Mm-hmm. rather than with like, just the way people's memories or whatever affect the way they see things, right? But some studies have shown that there are differences in sensitivity to color between men and women, for example, and it's got something to do with the fact that some women have with the rods and cones in their eyes, have some that are sensitive to a little bit more of the sort of bluish violet end of the spectrum. And so if you were somebody who had that sort of setup, you might perceive different, a more I don't know how to put it. Like you might be able to more finely distinguish different shades on that end of the spectrum.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so that's one example, yeah, that I can think of. And then who was next? Danica?
Yes, I'm gonna try and explain this. I don't know if I'm gonna use the right words, but like in regards to like that color example, I work with children who have exceptionalities and like as an early childhood educator, and like when speaking about perceptions of colors and stuff, like I've had that interaction where some children will view colors differently, and then also on that part, are they just learning because we're telling them specifically that is that color, but they might view it differently?
Maybe. I mean, we run into this problem, or this question rather, when we look back in history too, or at different cultures that don't have certain words for certain colors. You know, for example, the ancient Greeks, you know, like how would you describe the ocean? Just anybody take a crack at it. Describe the ocean real quick. It is, what color would you say it is?
Vast and blue.
Yeah, blue. You know what the ancient Greeks described the ocean? What color they described the ocean? Wine dark. Right? What does that mean? When I look at the ocean, it doesn't look like it's wine. You know? So how did they see the ocean? Did they not see it as blue? I don't know. I think they
or they meant like windy, because like the waves.
Oh no, they meant the beverage. Yeah. Yeah, they did. They really meant the beverage. Because the Greeks were way into their wine. Oh, totally. Yeah.
Me too.
Opaque. Yeah, I mean, I think that might be what, like you say in the chat, Jeremy, maybe that's what they were trying to capture, is that not the color, but the fact that it's dark and you can't see through it. So these are the things we have to keep in mind when we try to answer these questions. Donovan, go ahead.
I think that the example is specifically like how a certain culture describes a thing on in terms of color. Also, it sort of gets at the fact that like even if the sort of like sensory experience of the world is universal, the language and the way like words and meanings are constructed is very arbitrary. And you get a really good sense of this if you learn like enough of another language to be proficient in it, because you start to get a sense for how like that difference in construction for that language causes like when you're trying to, you know, kind of convey the world in that language, you have to do it differently. Like there's different ways that you navigate various ideas. And it's kind of like how, like comparing like English to some of its like linguistic relatives, you'll have different words that have like close to the same meaning and vice versa. And so it's kind of like it sort of further pushes that sort of difference across cultures and how they view things.
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I'm not really, I wouldn't say I'm proficient enough in any other language to really know, you know, from my own experience what you mean. I think I do have a sense of what you mean. Like, yeah, and this is something that we'll probably, again, we'll bump into this again, the way that language can shape thought as we continue. But that's a very good point. Thank you. So let's talk about epiphenomenalism real quick. Epiphenomenalism is a little strange, or it might sound a little strange. Epiphenomenalism says that physical events cause mental events. So events in the brain cause things to happen in the mind, but mental events have no causal power over physical events. Now, sometimes this view is attributed to Julien Offray de Lametri in his book, L'Homme Machine, or Man Machine. He writes that the diverse states of the soul, or the mind, are always correlative with those of the body. So, and this is an interesting book. I actually have my students in my Minds and Machines seminar read this book. And if anyone's interested, I can provide a link to you. It's really not that long, and it's kind of funny. Basically, Lametri is kind of raging against Descartes and his dualism. Descartes says that animals are just soulless automatons, machines, beast machines, he called them. Man is a machine, but we're special because we have a soul. And Lametri, who was a physician, comes along and says to Descartes, who was trained as a Jesuit, like, you're a theologian. You don't know what you're talking about. You need to leave this to the doctors, to the physicians, Descartes. And he argues that no, we're just machines too. We're machines. Animals are machines. We're machines that have souls by virtue of the way that our machines, our bodies and brains work, right? So he's kind of an epiphenomenalist, I guess. I think he's more of a functionalist. But in any case, what he says here, the diverse states of the soul are always correlative with those of the body, certainly seems to suggest epiphenomenalism. That is, that physical events in the body cause events in the mind, but not the other way around, which is really weird if you think about it. I mean, if I raise my hand, I feel like I raised my hand. Not that some neurons fired and caused a signal to go, and no, I feel like I did that. So I don't know, epiphenomenalism is a little scary. Has some scary implications for free will. Is it possible to even have a physical event happen without Is it possible to have a physical event happen individually without the influence of a mental event? I'm not sure. I have to admit, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Like a physical event happening in the brain that doesn't cause a mental event?
Yeah. Like, would that make sense for that to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I want to say that no, I want to say no. If I'm a physicalist or an epiphenomenalist, I want to say no, but with the caveat that we might not be aware of the mental event that it causes, right?
Isn't that kind of suggesting like a disconnect between the mental and physical? Like suggesting that they are separate?
Kind of. I mean, epiphenomenalism might just be another kind of dualism.
Yeah.
Right? So, okay, so one more. So Jeremy Borg, and then I'll get to everybody's questions. So Jeremy says, is that the if a tree falls in the forest question? That's a funny question. Yeah. Well, it's not quite like that. It's basically like, well, if we're talking about the brain, then the question is, could there be some event in the brain that happens which doesn't cause a mental event? And if we're saying event in the brain, I mean events in the neural network, not other physical things in the brain. Yeah, Parkinson's. Well, Parkinson's is physical, is a physical thing that affects the mental. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. Maybe I'll circle back to that one. But anyway, so Donovan and then Ben.
Okay, so keep in mind, I have a very, very surface level understanding of what I'm referencing here, but I know I recall correctly in fields like quantum theory, it's like the idea of like superposition, where like there's like information that is not known until it is observed.
Right.
And in that light, I feel like that kind of implies that if we're looking at this philosophical theory from this angle, that kind of implies that consciousness has a material effect. And I'm not really sure, like I'm not really sure if there's like, is there a way to reconcile that, or?
Well, maybe. I mean, that's what we're here to try and do, right? But I wanted to, can you clarify that a little further? Like, in what way, like what's the comparison you're drawing between?
Okay, so it's sort of, I'm trying to, it's been a little bit since, so there's if I recall correctly, I don't know if it's this thing with quantum particles where if I recall correctly, you cannot know both like their position and velocity with certainty. And so
Yeah.
the act of observation has an effect on like, how they behave.
Yeah, well,
it's kind of like it's like the Schrodinger's cat kind of thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Technically, it's measurement. This is
Yeah,
called
okay.
This is called the measurement problem.
Yeah.
So it's not observing. This is something that this actually does get talked about in consciousness, like in consciousness studies, but it's usually people who are advocating for like a quantum theory of the mental.
Yeah.
But it's like, and some people make the mistake of suggesting that it's the observation is changing things, so it must be that there's a conscious mind observing affecting the world. Whoa.
I apologize, I forgot about the measurement bit. I actually I thought of that, but I couldn't figure out, I couldn't remember how it works into it, because I know there's the analogy of if you want to measure how long something is, you pull out a ruler and you measure it, but the act of moving the ruler onto that object affects the object.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing with quantum scale stuff, because we've got to bounce photons off of other photons, and so there's a certain amount of uncertainty. That's interesting. Yeah, so that's what's there. As far as how that relates to the mental, yeah, I don't know, it depends what kind of processes are going on in the brain, I suppose. I'm sorry if I'm not doing a very good job at answering your question.
I mean, I didn't do a very good job of asking it, so.
Oh no, all good. I'm gonna let's see, Ben, go ahead, and then we better finish our slide after your question, Ben.
I just want to ask, regarding the original question, what about the brainstem? Would that have anything to do with because we were talking about physical events and mental events, because you're not always conscious of what your brain's doing, because it controls your heart and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say that, well, this is a really cool example, right? Of mental events not having causal power on the physical, is I can't make my heart stop beating by thinking about it, right? So that's definitely epiphenomenal. Even though I can kind of get the subjective sense of my pulse, and I can have a conscious experience, I can't, turn my heart off, right? So that is the problem. The question is, we know that physical events can cause mental events, but can mental events cause physical events? Is it really a mental event that causes me to raise my hand? Or is it all physical events? If it's all physical events, and my sense that I'm the one raising my hand is just an illusion with no causal power, that's epiphenomenalism, right? So that's what Lametri seems to be suggesting. This is also what Thomas Henry Huxley seems to be suggesting. Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. He was a defender of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, a very vocal defender, because of course Darwin wasn't really. So he argued that epiphenomenalism is true. He called humans and animals conscious automata, conscious robots, basically. Automata, or automaton, singular, is basically an early version of a robot. Now, if epiphenomenalism is true, though, how come we can talk about conscious mental states? They're not supposed to have causal power, right? Aha, checkmate. Actually, I'm not sure. This is a difficult question to answer, but it's true. Blackmore raises this point here. If epiphenomenalism is true, then how can I even talk about how can I talk about my conscious mental states? That would seem to imply that my conscious mental states do have some causal power on what my brain. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Okay. There's other kinds of monism, like neutral monism. The world's made of one kind of stuff. Let's get myself out of the way. And it's not strictly mental nor physical. This was a theory that was advocated famously by the early psychologist and philosopher William James. So James wanted to be neutral. He didn't want to say that everything was either mental or that everything was physical. It's some kind of fundamentally whatever stuff there is maybe has a sort of dual aspect to it, right? And that's related to the view that I was asked about earlier called panpsychism. This is where all physical things have some kind of mental properties. They may be, some may be more primitive than others, but everything in the universe, if panpsychism is true, would be conscious to some extent or another. So there would be something that it's like to be a rock or an electron, just like there's something that it's like to be a human being. Now, Owen Flanagan calls the advocates of panpsychism the new Mysterians. Sounds like it would be a good name for a band. The new Mysterians, why are they Mysterians? Why does he call them this? Because they're not explaining anything with panpsychism. It's just another mystery. How does consciousness work? How do we solve this problem of how the meat machine in my brain, physical system, generates a subjective conscious experience? Well, maybe everything is just a little bit conscious. Okay, but how does that work, right? Now we've got an even bigger mystery to explain. So that's why Flanagan calls this group of scholars the new Mysterians. Whoopsie daisy. And now we get to the dreaded Cartesian dualism, named for René Descartes, a very important figure in the scientific revolution. He was a philosopher, a mathematician, trained as a Jesuit, which is kind of like a philosopher priest, if that makes sense, in the Catholic Church. And what he did was apply a method of extreme skepticism or methodological doubt to work out what he could be certain of. And he does this in his book, Meditations. He also does it in the Discourses on the Method. Basically the same books, just written in different languages. Well, no, that's a bit of an oversimplification. But anyway, Descartes is doubting everything. He's doubting whether he could be awake or dreaming, doubting whether he could be deceived by an evil genius. I mean, I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar with Descartes, but just in case we're not, right, in the first and second Meditations, he's going through all his beliefs because he's trying to sort of take out anything that he's not certain of so that he can build his knowledge back up. And he reasons that he could be being deceived by this supremely powerful evil genius, like somebody who's powerful like a god, but who's malicious, deceiving Descartes about everything, like that 2 + 2 = 4, or that triangles have 3 sides, right? Deceiving him about things that he thinks he's certain of. But Descartes says that, hang on, if I'm being deceived, well, there must be somebody being deceived, namely me. So that's what gets him to the so-called cogito. This is called the cogito. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum in Latin. So that's what he can be certain of. He can be certain that as long as he's thinking, he exists. But the thinking self, he concludes, his soul, is not material. It's immaterial. And that's why this is substance dualism, because we've got an immaterial substance, the soul or the mind, and the material substance, extended things, matter. And this is what bodies are made of. Human bodies, candles, right? Whoops. So we have extended stuff, or res extensa. Oh, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. We have extended substance, res extensa, matter, stuff that takes up space, that has volume, has mass. And then we have res cogitans, thinking substance. That's the soul. That's the part that thinks. Now, there are still some dualists that exist today. They're not substance dualists necessarily. They're methodological dualists. Thank you. So methodological dualism isn't talking about substances, what kind of substances exist. It's more about how we describe things, right? We can describe people in mental terms or in physical terms, but we can't reduce one to the other. And this is nice because it avoids the need for two different substances, but we still have the mind-body problem. If we can't reduce the physical to the mental or the mental to the physical, then how do we explain how the mind and body interact? How do the mental and physical interact? So methodological dualism is sometimes called dual aspect theory. It doesn't go quite as far as substance dualism does. So it's free of some of the problems of substance dualism, but some problems still remain. Here's another quote where Blackmore, I think, really hits the nail on the head. The mind-body problem. The insuperable problem for substance dualism is how the mind interacts with the body when the two are made of different substances. So the mind-body problem is very prevalent in substance dualism. How do the mind-body interact? This is almost impossible to give an account for if you think that the mind and the body are made of different substances, of thinking substance and extended substance, respectively, right? So physical events, must give rise to ideas and sensations in some way, and mental events must give rise to things like speech and action and, things like uttering sentences and raising your hand. And we need to explain how this works. Descartes' explanation is somewhat lacking. I mean, he thought it occurred in the pineal gland, which is a little gland in the brain. Actually has something to do with your endocrine system, regulating hormones and stuff. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the mind and the body interaction problem. But Descartes thinks that the pineal gland is the location where I guess the soul is fixed to the body, but this still doesn't really solve the problem. It gives us a location for where I guess the magic happens, but it doesn't tell us how it works, right? And really, this is all to do with the fact that dualism just doesn't seem to work. We've known this for a while now. Substance dualism, especially methodological dualism, is maybe a little bit less problematic, but substance dualism just does not work, not as a science or as a philosophy. It raises more questions than it answers, right? So how does the mind work? If we explain how the mind works with substance dualism, if we take the metaphysical position of substance dualism, then we're left with more questions than we started with. And that means we've got a bad explanation, because we want fewer questions, because we're trying to explain things, right? So, yeah, dualism held sway for a bit, I suppose. Although there were contemporary attempts to try and respond to the mind-body problem raised by Descartes from other scholars. For example, Leibniz. Leibniz does it with his ideas about monads. Spinoza does it by saying that, well, there's only one substance, and Spinoza's a pantheist, so Spinoza comes along and says, like, well, there's only one substance, and it's God or nature, same thing. And we're just like little finite modifications of different attributes that the substance has, two of which are thought and extension. So anyway, I digress. When we get to the late 19th, early 20th century, people start calling out the problems with dualism, like Gilbert Ryle. Gilbert Ryle was a philosopher at Oxford University. He was the doctoral supervisor of Daniel Dennett, in fact, who we'll encounter later in this class. And Ryle calls dualism the dogma of the ghost in the machine. And I think this is one of the coolest phrases in all of philosophy. It sounds really neat. But what does he mean? Well, on dualism, it's almost as if the soul were, as Ryle puts it, a ghost inhabiting some kind of robot body, right? And that's kind of the sense you get from Descartes too, where we have this machine body. We are automata. We're like machines made by God, and the pineal gland is where the soul sits and interacts with the body. This is the ghost in the machine. It's kind of like, about to get really nerdy here. Disclaimer, a lot of nerdiness will happen in this class. I'm just saying. So hope that's cool, but it's very illustrative when it comes to explaining these ideas. But if you want to understand the ghost in the machine, think of like anime. Does anybody watch anime? A couple people? Okay. So like the mecha genre, we've got Gundam, Evangelion, all that stuff. We got a giant robot with a person in it. The robot is like the body, and the pilot is like the soul. Yeah. Gundam anime is dope. I agree. Anime is wonderful. And the ghost in the machine is almost as if the soul is some kind of pilot in a mecha, which is the human body, right? And Ryle thinks that this is the wrong way to think about things, right? We shouldn't think about the mind, doing things as if it's some kind of controller for the body. Minds aren't like, these nice little neat entities that make the body do things. Minds should rather be understood in terms of functions and processes, right? Oh, that's funny. I'll have to try and find that episode. I always like Futurama, but that's clever. Yeah. Possessed by how does that even work? I'm gonna have to go watch that. But yeah, we should understand the mind in terms of processes and functions, not as if it's like a thing inside of a body that makes the body do things, right? It's kind of like we're thinking of the mind as well, no, that's trying to think of a way to put this that'll clarify it with an analogy to other things that the body does. I mean, if you think of something, and I kind of hate to use this example because it's from John Searle, and John Searle, problematic guy, but he kind of talks about consciousness as being something like a biological process. So it's not a ghost in the machine. It's maybe more like something like digestion, right? Which is just a physical process, or life itself, right? Like I said earlier, we don't need élan vital to explain life, because now we know about genes, growth, development, all of that stuff, metabolism, so we don't need élan vital to explain life, right? Same with the ghost in the machine, or the soul, perhaps. All right, there aren't too many dualists today, but before I tell you about that, go ahead, Ayman.
Oh, how funny that you mentioned there aren't many dualists. Because I kind of believe that sort of theory, but that's mostly because I come from a religious background. So I'm a bit kind of confused when it comes to philosophers talking about like the mind and soul.
Yeah.
In my perspective, those like things are separate but coexist together, because like, how would we feel things like regret for actions that we don't want, but yet like temptations like our bodies want, like consuming alcohol or drugs, and then we
Yeah.
end up crying about it, you know?
Yeah,
That's how I
exactly.
don't view it.
That's interesting because, you know, for a long time, and I'm just sorry for the little self-promotion here, but this is kind of what my last class was about, last semester, my Minds and Machines class, which I have some lectures on YouTube, my YouTube channel, if anyone wants to check them out, you know. But, you know, the question is, what is the soul? And for a long time, throughout human history, in many different cultures, the soul and the mind were kind of treated as the same thing. I think that thinking of the soul and mind as different things is actually quite modern, right? Because we've learned more about the mind and the brain, and we've sort of separated some of those aspects from how we think of the soul compared to maybe a few hundred years ago, right? So maybe that's why it, like, when I'm teaching this, I'm teaching it like from a sort of historical philosophical perspective where for most of human history, the mind and the soul were just the same thing. There was no difference in how we understood that, right? All the things that the mind does, like if you were to ask Descartes, he would say all the things the mind does, thinking, morality, you know, knowing the difference between right and wrong, are all functions of the soul. That's what he would have told you, right? So yeah, if what I say sounds a bit weird, in that respect, it's because I'm kind of taking this historical perspective.
Okay.
Yeah. But then again, you know, in some languages, the difference is still there, or the difference is there, but it's not there. Like in German, there's this word Geist, which means ghost, spirit, but also mind, right? So yeah, very cool. Now, when I say few dualists exist today, by the way, I mean in philosophy and science. There are lots of dualists that exist today. Totally lots of dualists. And this is why I kind of mentioned it, you know, in the outset of the class. You know, there are many people coming into this class from different perspectives, different religious perspectives, perhaps, right? So this is why I mentioned this, because you know, we're tackling these kinds of questions that really cut close to these you know, questions about the soul and God and stuff. And while there aren't a lot of dualists in philosophy anymore, there are a lot of dualist people. You know, people who may believe in some religion, right? If you believe in one of the Abrahamic religions, or maybe even Hinduism, I would say the soul is not. Probably the only exception might be Buddhism, because on Buddhism, the self is an illusion, right? But yeah, if you're an adherent to one of these religions, you're probably a dualist, right? Because you've got to believe in a soul. So there are lots of dualists, but just not in philosophy.
Okay.
Yeah. But two dualists that are kind of famous from the 20th century in philosophy are Karl Popper and John Eccles. And they propose this kind of dualist interactionism theory. They say that physical processes in the brain can be influenced by a non-physical thinking and feeling self. But they don't really explain how this is supposed to work, right? And that's kind of a problem. Similarly, Benjamin Liebe, a very famous neuroscientist who actually did some really interesting studies on free will, which we'll talk about later in the class. He hypothesized a conscious mental field, which I suppose is meant to be analogous to the idea of a force field in physics, you know, like an electric field or a magnetic field, a field that emerges from brain activity and communicates within the brain without using synaptic connections. That's a really cool idea. But again, it's not explained how this might work. So these are interesting ideas, but they're not explanations, right? David Chalmers is probably the most well-known kind of maybe a dualist today. I really don't want to I really don't want to make it seem like I'm ripping on David Chalmers here, because he's an excellent scholar. So I'm not trying to rip on him by saying he might be a dualist, but he does kind of seem to be a sort of property dualist. He's famous for advocating for, the development of, he thinks we may discover new laws of nature that govern the mental, which sounds like either dualism or panpsychism. But I think he's probably more of a methodological dualist rather than, he's definitely not a substance dualist, I don't think. So, I'm not trying to rip on Chalmers here, but what about dualism? Why are there not many dualists in philosophy today? Well, as Dennett says, accepting dualism is like giving up, because it raises more questions than it answers, particularly substance dualism. So the lurking specter of dualism, as Blackmore describes it, is present in psychology's treatment of consciousness. We can see how scary dualism is, Blackmore is saying, by looking at how little psychologists discuss consciousness. So that's kind of interesting. Now let's see, we've got, how much time do we have? We've got about 7 minutes. I don't know if we can finish, but we'll go as far as we can. So the term psychology actually first appeared in the late 18th century, and it was originally a branch of philosophy. It was the philosophy of mental life. Sorry, I just have a message here I have to answer. So yeah, originally psychology was the philosophy of mental life. And as we get toward the end of the 19th century, it starts to mature into a science in its own right. Some are more objective, like the psychophysicists. And other branches of psychology are more interested in people's subjective experiences. Thinkers like William James or Sigmund Freud, for example. Speaking of William James, in his book, The Principles of Psychology, he writes that psychology is the science of mental life, both of its phenomena and their conditions. So James is very comprehensive when he's talking about what psychology ought to study, or rather, he thinks psychology ought to be a very comprehensive area of inquiry. So James thinks that psychologists ought to study everything from thoughts, emotions, sensations, beliefs, desires, all the stuff that occurs in our subjective conscious experience. In fact, if you've heard the term stream of consciousness, well, that term is actually due to William James, the stream of consciousness. So consciousness, all the subjective stuff here that James was interested in was at the heart of psychology for William James. But he also thought that we need to include the brain as well. He wasn't just interested in the subjective. Remember, William James is a neutral monist. He thinks that there's one kind of thing that ought to be able to explain the mental and the physical, right? Or that is, well, the mental and the physical are ultimately one kind of thing. He talks about people's subjective thoughts, emotions, sensations, of course, but he also points out how, different drugs like alcohol or opium or maybe hashish, all very popular in the late 19th century, can change one's consciousness, right? Alcohol will make you intoxicated. Opium will make you sleepy. Hashish, I suppose, makes you really high, right? And although we don't describe, or James didn't describe the effects in this way, we know now why these substances do these things. It's because of how they affect the brain. And James was also able to build on the findings of psychophysics, which is another really interesting area that sort of helped birth psychology. Psychophysics is the study of how physical stimuli like auditory stimuli, visual stimuli, are related to reportable sensations. What's the relationship between outer events, like a sound or a light, and inner experience, like perceived volume or perceived brightness? And this was started in the mid-19th century, where we had people like Weber and Fechner. And they were studying the relationships between some of the things that I just mentioned, like luminance and perceived brightness, between weight and perceived heaviness, between sound pressure and loudness, right? So they're studying all these interesting relationships between objective events and subjective experiences. And psychophysics is very interesting for that reason. And around the same time, we have Hermann von Helmholtz measuring the speed of nerve signals. He calls this the velocity of thought. That would also be a cool name for a band. Von Helmholtz was also pretty interested in visual illusions. Actually, a lot of early psychologists were interested in visual illusions, like Titchener or Ebbinghaus. In fact, there are optical illusions named after these thinkers. The Ebbinghaus illusion, Titchener circles, very cool. And you can look some of those up with a quick Google search if you like. So von Helmholtz also proposed that perceptions are unconscious inferences. And this is a view that we'll probably encounter as we continue. But one idea of the mind that's quite popular these days is that the mind is kind of like a hypothesis generator, and that this is how perceptions might work. That the brain is basically generating, making predictions about the world and building experiences when those predictions turn out to work. So our brain is like a little scientist in our heads. Very weird, but very cool. So we'll talk about that more as we go through the class. But von Helmholtz's ideas of unconscious inferences are very similar to the psychologist Richard Gregory's idea that perceptions are, as I just mentioned, hypotheses about the world. William James had a similar idea. He called it unconscious cerebration. And yes, although this may sound very weird, maybe there is unconscious thought, unconscious cognitive processes. And I don't mean in the Freudian sense, where there are things just lurking in the unconscious, right? I mean that some thinking actually gets done unconsciously, which is really cool and really counterintuitive. So it's 12:55. I think we better leave it there. So we're doing pretty good. We've almost minimized this. We've almost finished the first chapter of Blackmore. So I think what we'll have to do is wrap up these slides for our first lecture next week. And then we will move on to begin chapter 2, which is all about the hard and easy problems. Okay, Sarah has a question. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, I missed the first lecture they're recorded, right?
Yeah, they're recorded and they're posted to my YouTube channel, and you can find links to the recordings on Brightspace.
Okay, thank you so much.
No problem. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think we should probably wrap it up. And I'll see you all next Wednesday, where we'll pick up our discussion of the unconscious, talk a little bit about Freud, excuse me, wrap up our chapter, and then we'll move on to chapter 2. So with that said, thanks everybody. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember, next week, I'm going to start taking attendance. So, just keep that in mind. And I hope everyone has a good weekend. So take care. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.